I would like to introduce today's speaker, who is John Buckingham, who's a senior advisor in life sciences here at MaRS. John has been building healthcare businesses for over 30 years. He spent most of his career working at the interface of research and commercial functions in innovative healthcare manufacturing organizations. Excuse me. Now he brings his experiences assessing new technologies, leading negotiations and designing partnerships to MaRS. John uses his extensive background in pharma licensing and global business development to help MaRS life science and healthcare companies build sustainable, scalable businesses. I should say that I've had the great honor of working with John for a couple of years here at MaRS, and his experience, from the pharma sector, in particular from J&J and Endo Pharmaceuticals, is tremendously helpful because he knows exactly what companies are looking for. He knows what the terms of agreements typically are, and also knows the art or the skillful means for getting around roadblocks. So John truly has a tremendous wealth of experience, and look forward very much to learning more today. John.
You always have a good capability of embarrassing me, so thank you so much. Well, I appreciate you all coming today. I'm looking to share a fairly high-level overview of alliance management as I see it, and so I'll say right up front, for those of you who know me, I really like interactive sessions. So as we go through this, if there are things you see that pique your curiosity, or you're not exactly sure what I'm trying to say, because I do struggle with language sometimes, then feel free to jump right in, and we'll have a conversation as opposed to a one-way kind of thing. Now, if I'm technically competent, I can actually move between presentations, but I'm probably, maybe, yes, look at this. And we'll get started. Excellent, okay. So there's three things I wanted to share with you first before we get into the presentation. One of them is that it's really the how did I get here. John talked about my background in negotiating deals. And I used to do a lot of that when I was with Johnson & Johnson, and I came to appreciate that the performance of the deals after they've been negotiated, and of course the deals that I negotiated were all just perfect. There was nothing wrong with those deals. But somehow the alliances may work or may not work for a variety of things. And I came to learn that making that deal work was a really important function. So I got more and more engaged in trying to think through what the implementation process was. And that actually led me into a professional career in alliance management. Secondly, I have a passion for a business model that is alliance-centered. I moved from Johnson & Johnson, which you all know, very large company, to Endo Pharmaceuticals, which is a semi-virtual company with $600 million in sales when I joined it, and about 300 employees, which is really high leverage, by the way, for a pharmaceutical company. And I left 4 years later, and the company was $1.25 billion. And aside from the sales force that had been built out, there were about 400 employees internally. So an alliance-centered business model is something you can do not just because you have to when you're starting up. And for those of you who are in our peer-to-peer CEO forum for life sciences companies, they know that I've been starting up companies too. This is a model that works when it has to, but when you get larger and you have the capabilities to do things yourself in the company, it's still something that makes a lot of sense to follow. And lastly, which speaks to the title of the talk, the partner or perish concept. I first gave this talk a little over 2 years ago, right in the middle of an economic situation, which is, believe it or not, worse than it is right now. And so the ability to raise capital was just unbelievably difficult. And so there was a lot of pressure to figure out how could you do more with less and work with partnerships as a way to move your business models forward. So those are some of the things that bring me to this sort of topic, and I hope to share with you a number of things that relate to this. I want to address three key questions today. The concept of when I have something to do in my business, do I build it myself or do I partner? What are the kinds of things you think about? Secondly, what defines a competent partnering organization? So as you build your companies, think about what is it that I need to do so that I'm actually a good partner and able to get the partnerships I'm involved in to deliver the goods. And then finally, when you look at a specific alliance, how do you build and maintain one? So going from the broad to the narrow and trying to get a view on that. So I'll talk to each of these in turn, and I'll trigger you as I'm moving from one topic to another, and if I miss it, I'm sure you'll keep me on track. For those of you who want to know more about alliance management than I can cover in the next, John, you didn't say, am I speaking for 2 hours or 3 hours today?
I think it's all afternoon.
It's all afternoon? Okay, thank you. If I can't cover it in this session, there are some opportunities to continue to learn. There is a global organization for strategic alliance professionals which has a wealth of resource materials, best practices, that if you wish to pursue this and learn more, it's actually very good. There's also a group in Toronto called CORE, the Center for Outsourcing Research and Education, which focuses on supply chain and a few other related kinds of partnerships, but they have some good resources as well. And, oh, isn't that interesting? And for those of you who really are interested in the field and would like to become professionally certified, there are 2 levels of certification available at this stage, Certificate of Achievement, and then the last is a Certified Strategic Alliance Professional. So there are exams and all the rest, but then you really are someone who's lived it and knows how to explain it and do it as an alliance professional. But let's go into some basics. Everyone's got a definition of what an alliance is and what it isn't, and people tend to use the terms alliance, collaboration, partnerships somewhat interchangeably, and I do it too. But I think these are some worthwhile concepts to keep in mind. That an alliance is a collaboration. There's at least a couple of parties, can be more, that are trying to achieve something together. They're between independent organizations that retain their own autonomy, so it's not a merger. It's when you have 2 companies that are distinct and stay distinct, but they're working to a joint purpose. They're both committing resources, so it's not a transaction where one party says, I want you to do this, and when you've done it, I'm just going to pay you the money and we're all set. And then it's run with an incomplete contract. And so that also distinguishes it from a transaction relationship, like a service agency, you know, an ad agency in the commercial field or wherever. An incomplete contract in the sense that not everything that you're going to do together is so well specified in terms of time and dimension that you know how it's going to work out. It is a collaboration and it follows a certain path. Before I go too much further, and now that we've filled pretty well all the seats, maybe I can get a little feedback about who I'm talking to today. Who here has actually led an alliance? Managed an alliance? Anyone? Okay, we've got one. We've got 2. Who's worked in an alliance before, in a collaboration? Okay, great. And now who's going to be getting into one pretty soon? Oh, well, okay, then we've got a well-primed audience here. Okay. So I tend to group alliances into 2 major categories, and whether you're working in the information technology area or in the healthcare arena or any of a number of other fields, I think these still apply. I call operational alliances ones where you're working with a partner that actually does a function of your firm. And you've made a decision, perhaps your supply chain, for example. You say, look, I'm innovating a product, I'm going to commercialize the product, but I really don't intend to become an expert in how to inventory it and ship it and do all of the rest. That would be an operational alliance. It's an ongoing business function that you have a partner work with you to do. Project alliances, on the other hand, are often the kinds of things that your innovation work may lead to, where you work with a partner who will co-develop a project or commercialize the project or co-commercialize it with you. And it's a more defined project. you've got milestones along the way, and there's always a defined end. It may be 10 years away or 15 years away if everything goes perfectly, but there is a defined end to the process. So worthwhile keeping those things in mind, but how you manage the two of them is really not that different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an alliance business model. This is something that I support. Think about it as the contrast of what in the healthcare field we call a FIPCO. A fully integrated pharmaceutical company is one that does everything itself and doesn't go out to partners to do anything else and has complete control over every aspect of the operation. And I'll tell you, having worked in a large pharmaceutical company, control is really good. But it's not a business model that works anymore, and we'll talk about some of those reasons. The first thing when you're looking, this is addressing question number one, by the way, of do I build a capability or do I partner, is to decide what is the core capability of your firm. What is it that you have to be able to say, this is where I create value, this is where I contribute. These are the key, it's the essence of the firm. And a really important discussion. By the way, the slides will all be available on the MaRS website. So
I just had the operation on my finger, that's why.
Okay. Well, I mean, please continue. I mean, that's. But in addition to your core capabilities, you think about a couple of other things. First, sometimes you don't have the bandwidth to do everything that you think is core. You may be able to do all of the planning yourself, but the execution of some of those core functions you need help with. And so you may put together alliances to share the load, to handle peak levels of activity. And examples of this would be things like a firm has a lawyer who's routinely retained to help you with your issues, but you may have a relationship with a legal firm that you can draw on at times to do the implementation of patent filings and hopefully not litigation, but those sorts of things happen. But then there are also the complementary kinds of functions like supply chain that we talked about, or for example, in the healthcare field, the implementation of clinical studies. So in a healthcare business, for example, your core capability might be to design the clinical studies to get the results that you're going to need for registration and commercialization. But the nitty-gritty aspects of signing up study sites and enrolling patients and doing all of the data analysis and pulling together the reports, that could be something that is a clinical operations function that's a partner for your firm. And you may decide that's not our core capability. It's essential, but it's not our core capability. So this is more and more a business model that you're starting to see. Actually, the information technology field is farther ahead in exploring how alliances can work than the healthcare field has been. But the healthcare field is moving very rapidly to this kind of model. Eli Lilly, for example, has moved out a lot of its research and discovery activities to a network of partnerships. And they have explored also farming out the development of certain compounds in their portfolio to other companies, and then they are brought back in at a defined stage. Bristol Myers Squibb has essentially outsourced all of its manufacturing operations, or at least stated that as their objective, and they said that's not our core capability. But somebody has to make the drug. It's essential to move it forward. So when you start thinking about alliances, I mean, some people think, oh my gosh, this is going to be a headache and it's going to require more effort, and boy, when I just have the money, I'll be able to do it myself and I can get away. And I'd argue that when you're looking to advance your company goals, there's some things that alliances can do for you that are really hard to do, even if you're a well-established mid-sized company. For example, getting ready access to expertise in a given area can be really tough. So for example, if you want to build your own supply chain operations, you're going to have to attract good people. You'll have to go through an organizational learning curve. You're going to be trying to compete for attention with various other stakeholders in all of this. An alliance with an established partner whose business is to provide supply chain activities is right at the top of the technical curve if you choose wisely, and takes your business seriously, and you can get better results out of this. Flexible resources, really important, because everybody knows there are times when things are going great and then not so great. And it's tough as your business is expanding and contracting if they're all your employees. With a partner, it's a lot easier to ramp up and ramp down when you have to. And this is increasingly being seen in terms of how fast you can get your products to development. If you think about the difference as you're growing, that, for example, you move into a new area and you say, I've got to bring in the people who can help me develop this and then get them established, and that whole process of bringing people on board can take 3 to 6 months and then get to work on the project. You find where speed is of the essence, and I'd argue that it is for most of us, whether it's patent clock driven or not. Competition in IT is tough, and in healthcare it's patent driven. Alliances can often get you into the development curve a lot faster. And those first 3 elements really come down to the reduced financial risk piece of all of this. And that is critical. As you're looking to attract more and more partners to help you with your business, it's important to have some capabilities in the early part. But as you're raising funding, you know that it's all about perceived risk. As you're trying to get somebody to invest in your business, they'll go, great idea, but can these guys execute? You know, do they know what they're doing? Can they conserve cash? All of these things really help. However, when you take a look at putting alliances together, the track record has been poor in terms of them delivering their stated objectives. And that's the real challenge in all of this. Most of us aren't really, really good about building and maintaining professional relationships. Personal relationships we can talk afterwards about, though some of these same principles apply. But a lot of them come down not to the project having a technical issue, but they come down to relationship issues. The partner's goals, which at the beginning seem to be aligned, become misaligned. People change, companies change. Miscommunications are rampant between parties that are in different geographic places. And we all know how bad email can be as a tool of communication and getting people upset for no reason. Poor execution for all sorts of reasons, such as resources not being committed by one party when they should be, and you're saying, well, I thought you were going to deliver this 2 months ago. It's, yes, we're still working on it, you know. Changed financial prospects for one of the partners so that they can't invest, or one of them becomes more distracted by something else. And last on that list is technical failure. And one of my colleagues in this field argues that most technical failures are because projects get delayed and under-resourced because of the other elements above there. They don't have the management commitment, and therefore they don't get the resources, and therefore the product ends up being a technical failure, which, by the way, I include being 5th to market as opposed to 1st to market, if that was your goal. So now we get into question 2 about, you know, what does alliance competency look like so that you can make your record of success higher. And the first element of this is, you know, the reason that you want to do it is that it's not to have people think well of you. It's because you're interested in getting the results that you expected or better out of your alliances. And part of it includes meeting or managing the expectations within your organization and your partner's organization. So there's an execution piece, but there's a setting of expectations piece. And I'm sure all of us have stories of when we thought we've done a great job and somebody else just doesn't see it that way. You know, so, well, I thought you were going to do A and you've done B, so what? And you're going, oh, B is the best thing that ever happened. And so this is part of the communication process and goal setting process that we pay attention to. There are a couple of aspects here that relate to organizational competency that if you do this well, you're going to improve your company's ability to perform better on the next partner alliance. So that's the institutional learning component of this. And you also build some best practices that work for your company in what works in how you set up alliances and how you manage them. I'm not a particular believer that a best practice applies to everybody. Every company has its own unique culture, capabilities, personality, processes, and those are things that it's useful to pay attention to best practices that are used elsewhere in the industry, but you almost always have to tailor them to your own organization. And so if you have a lens in your company that says, I want a perspective on how we manage our partnerships and what works for us and what doesn't work for us, then you're more likely to continue succeeding with that kind of model. The end result of this is your company reputation as a good partner pays dividends for you. It allows you to get engaged with other more qualified partners because you can be taken credibly as an organization that can execute and deliver results. And of course, from a fundraising point of view, it certainly helps. In the work that I've done with a number of companies, including at Endo Pharmaceuticals, where my job was to start up an alliance management function and sort of formalize a culture around this, I finally boiled it down to 4 key areas of organizational competency and individual competency that needed to be built to a higher level than what you do in your own organization. So, I mean, if you look at this list, these are all things that you would say, of course I do these and I have some capability, and within my own company, I have to do this on a cross-functional team, for example. But when you think about dealing with a partner that is always different from you, they're bigger, they're smaller, they're farther away, they speak a different language as their mother tongue, they're geographically diverse from you, they have different goals and objectives, you find that you have to work harder at these things and be better at these things. And so these are some of the areas that as an organization you need to up your game in an alliance. We talked about the inherent problems with email, for example, as a communication method. Some of the best practices that I've used in the past as you start up an alliance are by absolutely insisting that the operational teams and the governance teams meet face-to-face for the first couple of months or 3 months of operations, so that there is a personal relationship that's built, but more importantly, an understanding of where your partners are coming from. Because without that context, you find it can get really interesting. Leading by influencing. I mean, clearly you have no one hierarchy that controls the actions of both partners. And so when you're working with a partner, a large part of your job when you're managing the alliance is trying to give them the arguments that they can use with their management to get the resources and decisions in a timely way to make the alliance work. And clearly, these skills are ones that everyone uses every day, but you use them in a more formal way in an alliance structure, which, by the way, is not very different from what negotiations are when you're putting a deal together. I found there's a lot that I had learned from the BD field that was directly applicable to what you're doing in an alliance structure on a day-to-day basis. The gaining value from diversity, you think about it as the not invented here syndrome that you see in some companies. I think we all know individuals who say, if the person I'm talking to doesn't seem to have the right background, doesn't seem to come from a culture that I respect or whatever, ideas get discounted and perhaps not considered. And this is all about open-mindedness. Some of the best organizations that I've worked in have had some really, really diverse backgrounds of people in the group. And by the way, when you're in a problem-solving mode, I can't think of a better kind of group to work with than with people who don't all think alike right from the beginning. So that's a key skill, and it leads to the perception also of respect between the partners, which is really important to this last aspect. Building and maintaining trust is probably the cornerstone of making partnerships work. And there are defined ways to actually go about this in a methodical, planned kind of way. I think we all know that building trust can take considerable time. Destroying trust can happen in a heartbeat if you don't manage that sort of thing well. But there are ways to build in a structured way, as I mentioned. There's ways to test for the level of trust that you have between your organizations and individuals. And there are steps to take when you don't have the level of trust you need to go forward. This, if it breaks down between organizations, is the end of the alliance. You can't get anything done if the parties don't trust each other. Everything will be second-guessed. Decisions won't get made. The project will fail. You have to do something. And so these kinds of competencies, all of them, and particularly this one, really require some mind share as you work through this. It's not just that I came from a background in Johnson & Johnson where I guess most of you know there's a company credo that is, does anybody know why there's a company credo within J&J? Why that's important? Does anybody who used to work for J&J? That's amazing. In a room this size, usually there's 3 or 4 people who used to work for J&J. Well, Johnson & Johnson works as a decentralized company. They have 115,000 employees right now. They have little over 250 distinct companies working in 60 different countries. And so to establish a single company culture, they put together a set of expectations of how people will behave and what they will consider as a priority. And so that actually drives the culture within J&J. And so one of my challenges when I got to Endo was I was working with a group of people. The company was had a certain amount of turmoil, and everybody was from all different backgrounds as the company was growing. There was no consistent way of thinking about how should we manage partners. Are they our friends? Are they our competitors? How do we do this? And so I put together a set of principles that helped the organization get more focused on how they're expected to behave in an alliance so that there is trust and you do build sufficient respect and you can get decisions made and you can learn together. I also found this very useful in working with partners of my company because I'd like them to behave in the same way, and then you can get things done. So there's a lot more information on these kinds of things and how they can help. When you're a small company, it's not so important. You've got such a small group of people that you're working with that a lot of these things happen naturally. But as you start to grow and you're working through 2 or 3 levels of the company that are working in a partnership, then you start to need to get a little more formal about setting expectations on how you behave. So I'm about to move into question 3. If I'm going too fast, or if I'm not giving you an opportunity to ask questions, you could jump in now. Going. Well, I'll keep on going, but do feel free to ask questions as we go through. There are a couple of key elements, and I'll build on these just a little bit as we go through, about how you organize yourself for an alliance. And the 2 key things from people point of view are there needs to be a senior management sponsor, someone whose goals, responsibilities are intimately tied to the success of that particular alliance. They have to have skin in the game. And there should be a dedicated alliance leader, and I'll talk about what the alternatives are as you go through this. Now, that may mean, dedicated, by the way, to me, doesn't mean that they're full-time. It means that they have a piece of their responsibilities, at least, that is important, and it is defined, and it comes up in performance reviews and all of those kinds of things. But there needs to be somebody who thinks of themselves as the leader of the alliance in your company. It's not a shared responsibility for me. it's the kind of thing that there's at least one person who stays up at night and thinks about, is everything going the way it should be, and what else do I need to pay attention to? So let's talk about senior management sponsorship. I did a certain body of work a few years ago in talking to CEOs of a variety of companies who were involved in alliances, and talked to them about a wealth of things. What sorts of information they got, how did they handle dispute resolution, what level of communication did they expect with their counterpart, who should they deal with, and I have some funny stories about that one. But some of the key factors that came out of that discussion is, if you have the right senior management sponsor and he or she understands what their role is, that's the person that really makes the resourcing and decision-making process happen in the company. So if you have somebody at a senior level who takes this seriously, you have a go-to person to get things done. Secondly, you need somebody at a senior level who can communicate at a senior level to your partner and make sure that if there are key issues facing the alliance, that you've got boardroom alignment on what is to be done and how the issue is perceived. Really important. It also drives alignment down through the organization. So even with a mid-sized company, everybody looks for cues as to what's important and what's a priority and how am I supposed to do things. So that role is critical. And the last, there's a variety, disputes are always going to come up in alliances. I mean, no matter how dedicated and well-meaning people are and competent people are, you're going to have differences of opinion. Do we do it now? Do we do it to this scope? And where you have both parties investing resources in moving things forward, sometimes you have things that are just tough to resolve. And there are dysfunctional ways to deal with those kinds of things that destroy an ability to work together in the future, or at least hurt it. And there are ways that actually strengthen it. And for those of you who are interested in some of those techniques, they're reasonably straightforward, but they are important, and you can count on disputes coming forward. So, talking about leadership alternatives, you've got a couple of ways in which larger companies particularly have approached alliances and said, we're going to have a division of responsibilities in our company. We're going to have someone who handles the internal teams that are supporting the alliance, and we'll have somebody who's responsible for the external partner and managing that. Or it may be organized such that we have someone who is responsible for the project objectives, and we have another person who's responsible for the relationship and meeting the commitments under the alliance. And that model can work in some cases where the two individuals work very closely together. My bias is much more to the side of it's one person who has the responsibility for the internal and the external, and has responsibility for achieving the goals of the project, as well as the relationship goals. And part of my bias comes from seeing situations in which somebody who is very goal-oriented from a project point of view can destroy the relationship with the partner by saying, I'm going to do this, I don't care what they think, I'm going to do it in ways that I know are going to tick them off, but that's not what I'm measured on. That's your job. You have to manage the relationship. Well, that becomes an impossible situation. And to really make an alliance work, you're often balancing these things. You do use all your influencing skills internally and externally to get to a good outcome for the project. But they have to be continued joint decisions, and you really don't want to be perceived as a bully in the relationship, or just an incompetent partner. And so I would urge you, if you're partnering with a company as you are developing your technology and they appoint an alliance manager, that may be one of the things that you want to understand, is the person who's responsible for the overall alliance one person or two? I haven't seen three, but and I hope I don't. I wanted to touch on a few other things as we go through this topic. One is, where do you spend your energies during the life cycle of an alliance? every alliance starts with a discussion, leads to a negotiation, an agreement. You implement the thing, you manage it for a period of time, and then it either transforms because something big changes, or it terminates. And all relationships in this field, they end. So you need to plan for those. And when you take a look at where alliance management gets more involved as a function, it's certainly involved during the contract negotiation phase, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it's heavily involved during the startup phase of a new partnership. And we'll talk in a bit about some of those things that you pay attention to get alliances off to a good start. And then the level of involvement from just a functional point of view, I'm not speaking of a person necessarily, but where you're applying alliance management techniques, usually continues at a fairly low level until there's a problem to be resolved. And then you get into it and you figure out what the problem is and work through to a solution. When you get to an alliance change or a termination, you get to the next phase of a project, or the project changes direction, or it's time to terminate, but with goodwill. I mean, you'd like your alliances to end where your partner says, yeah, I'd absolutely work with you again. You were a good partner and we achieved good things. Things just didn't work. So that gives you some sense of where your energies can be. And if you're trying to manage a number of alliances at the same time, it's helpful to know that most of them aren't all in a heavy resource stage at the same time. So you can balance these things as you go. So one of the things that's sort of near and dear to my heart is talking about the negotiation process when you're putting a deal together. To what extent do you need to be thinking about the downstream activities of managing an alliance? There's really two basic types of negotiations from my point of view. In our environment, there's transactions that you put together where you may not have much to do with each other after you finish the transaction. It's really about you're getting something for a resource and you're done. But there's another kind of negotiation, which is what most of us do, and that is putting together something that you then have to implement together and work through together, or it's a longer term relationship that you've worked out. And so my premise is you should be thinking about the alliance management process and engaging that perspective or individual, if you have someone who's responsible for that, early on in the process of figuring out who do you want to work with and how are you going to work together. There's a body of work that has been done on, it's this negotiation, one of the titles of one of the papers that I like is Negotiation with an Implementation Mindset. And for those of you that I've talked to before about negotiating techniques and how you approach things, it's the difference between a confrontational negotiation, a winner-take-all, last nickel on the table is mine kind of negotiation, as opposed to a joint problem-solving exercise, which actually works very well in setting up these kinds of things. Because all through the negotiation process, you're actually establishing the principles that you'll continue to use as you work through problems together after you've done the deal. Question?
Just a comment, it's actually a good test of trust, because if how they negotiate is going to be how they implement. And so you can set up little test studies for what they give and what they take, because you're going to run into problems later on.
I think that's a great comment, and I've actually a couple of times tried to make sure that we had a problem in the negotiation, just so that you could work through it together. And then both parties start to feel comfortable that if they encounter other problems, they can work through them together. And if you're in a competitive negotiation, it's really interesting how powerful that can be, because any deal that typically is done in the healthcare field, the real value of getting together in a deal is always downstream. It's not the upfront payments. I mean, they may be big, but the real value is the product gets on the market, it gets commercialized, it earns royalties over a long period of time. That is always worth more than the early payments in a deal. So the more that you can convince somebody that you're a partner that can be trusted, can work through the issues, is willing to listen to you, and that's why it's fun to set these things up early on. And then sometimes you may find it's not going to work. You may. And you may have to think very carefully about what am I going to have to do if this relationship is so important to me. What am I going to have to do to make it work? So there are some thoughts on where alliance management gets more involved. And of course, business development typically walks away from a deal, at least in the healthcare field, as soon as the deal is signed. It's, you know, I'm done, I'm transferring it, I'm moving on. And that's why it's helpful to have that mindset or individual engaged through the process.
So, John, do you see that changing now that some companies are starting to, say, have assigned a business development person who will then manage the alliance going forward? Is that not a trend that you're seeing in some companies going forward, or do you think it will still stay completely separate?
And I think it's a bit of a company size issue. I know in smaller companies the BD person is expected to maintain a relationship afterwards, but not in the role of managing the project. It's more like a safety valve. If the partner is unhappy, then they have somebody that they can call who they know because they've dealt with them across the negotiating table. But in larger companies, the skills that are important to business development are so valued in that function that you're typically not allowed to spend that time. And having spoken to counterparts at Bristol-Myers and Novartis and Lilly and certainly within J&J, that was always the case. You were actually discouraged from maintaining a relationship other than if there was another product opportunity coming through the pipeline, then of course you'd like to be in touch with them. But you'd always, if there was an issue with the current project, I'm sorry to hear that, I'll put you in touch with the right person, but no day-to-day involvement.
So, but would it then come together only at the CEO level, or would you have, say, a VP of both BD and alliance management?
Yes, we're actually going to talk a little bit about that, but my short take is when you put an alliance together, your chances for success improve if you form more relationships. I think it's dangerous if you only have two people talking to each other between the partners, unless it's a very, very simple project. There's just too many opportunities for miscommunication, and people leave. And you know, what do you do if the one critical relationship, suddenly there's no one there? Okay. Some of the things that alliance management groups are getting more and more involved in during the negotiation process are doing some due diligence in terms of how is the partner to work with. What are we going to have to pay attention to about how they make decisions, their cultural processes, just to help set our expectations internally. As you might expect, there are some companies that have so many levels of forums that decisions have to go through that decisions can take forever. And there are others where it's the CEO makes the call, you know, and things move along pretty smartly. They may not be as well informed, but they move. And effective relationship development starts right from the moment the first people are talking to each other. It's not just the BD people, but in the healthcare environment, you do what's called technical due diligence and a variety of other types of due diligence on your partners. You want to know if what they're saying is actually true, if there are things that have been overlooked in the data, and your team of people goes to meet with their team of people. That is a relationship building opportunity. So those teams get coached on how they are to behave. They shouldn't be there going, yes, I'm, you know, from where and where, just show me because I don't believe you. That's not a good start to the relationship. And then what the right collaboration structure is. Some companies are going to require more formal types of governance structures, and you're going to want to build into the contract that there will be a group that meets so often and speaks to these things, and another group that speaks to these things, and there are going to be others where you say, with what we know of this partner, we're comfortable that what we need is an executive steering committee, and everything else can be figured out as we go along. So those are considerations that are helpful to know as you work your way through. Okay, when you're putting together a new alliance, and we're thinking about just getting started here, some of the things you want to do immediately I mean, and best practices here are on the day of signing, you've actually figured out who the alliance leader is going to be, who the senior management sponsor is going to be, and also who are going to be on the teams that work with the partner. It is really disheartening as you start up an alliance for the contract to be signed, and there's this, everybody's going, wow, now we can get started. And they go, yeah, wait a few weeks while we figure out which people are going to work on the teams and do this. It's a really missed opportunity. So this is one of those things that makes a lot of sense to do. The things that happen shortly afterwards as you start up an alliance, and this should be happening with both partners, is there needs to be a communication of what is expected of the teams, how they're expected to work together, and they should know what the contractual requirements are of the deals. For those of you who may ever do a deal with Johnson & Johnson, I will advise you right up front that J&J tends to negotiate to balance the workload and resources being applied in the contract. And in the past, once the contract's signed, you can pretty well rely on J&J staff to step up and do it all for you if you let them. So the contractual requirements are sometimes, that's a good thing if you're a partner and you trust them to do it. You say, you'd like to do this, which would cost us money and the time of our people, go for it. And so it's worthwhile understanding what you're required to do and what your partner is required to do, so you can pay attention to how the deal is unfolding. There is a team formation and relationship building process that is important to do, and one of the most important elements of that is to meet face to face. You get to know each other personally at the beginning, particularly where a high level of collaboration will be needed. And one of the ways that you get everybody on the same page is to put together what we often call an alliance team charter. And this is, it's more a process than a document that we find teams work together at the beginning to define what exactly is it that we're going to do, who's going to be working with who, how are we going to communicate with each other, how are decisions going to be made, and this is all discussed explicitly within the teams so that people understand how things are going. It's about expectation setting and goal alignment and all the rest. And when it's well organized, typically takes about half a day to do that in a reasonably complex project. But the teams come out of it with a really good understanding of who's going to do what and how are we going to work together. So those are important things in getting things set up. And Alliance Team Charter, there are all sorts of templates here, and there are things like, how did we get into the alliance? What are we focused on? What are the roles and responsibilities? Our working guidelines? How are we going to measure ourselves? Milestones, maybe specific metrics that you set up around the partnership. Once you've got it all set up and you've had your integration meetings and everybody's gotten to work on their plans, you really enter the maintenance phase. And this should run fairly smoothly until there is a disruption, and there'll always be one. And one of the more important things to do through this stage is to check in with your partner, either formally with a web-based survey of some sort that goes out to the people who are involved in the alliance, or just scheduling some regular one-on-one interactions so that people feel comfortable to say, here's what I like about what's going on, here are the things that are bugging me in the relationship. And this is a really critical part of figuring out whether there are things that you need to address. I've used web-based surveys before, and the most important parts are the free field boxes at the end, where people get to say, what do you like about this alliance? What would you like to see change? And they come in as anonymous, but some people just pour their hearts out in these things and say, I am so frustrated by da-da-da. And it's a very good diagnostic tool in a relationship to check in and make sure that you understand what's going on. Those are the early warning signals of things that aren't going well. And they're also good signs that, perhaps there is a shared perception that this is a really good alliance and, things do seem to be working well. They're all good things to know. To your question, Hans, you know, how should we be working in terms of relationships? In a larger firm, you're going to have the Alliance Project team members talking to each other. You're going to have the Alliance Project leaders on each side talking to each other. There'll be a steering committee, an executive steering committee, which is a pretty common form. They should be talking to each other. And then there'll be a designated senior manager, maybe the CEOs of the companies. Usually the person who in a dispute resolution is the last person you go to before it goes to arbitration, hopefully never litigation, to get resolved. And so the more of these relationships that are in place, the better covered you are as people move. If it turns out that there's one or two of the relationships that aren't working particularly well, you're not relying on all of those. And I can speak perhaps better with this as a background on to the question of dispute resolution I touched on earlier. Dysfunctional dispute resolution in an alliance typically happens when one party has a gripe and decides to escalate it unilaterally on sort of this side. And so you have people perhaps at this level who aren't happy about what's going on, and they think they have the right, and they decide that they will bump it up to here. And so the CEO calls the other CEO who knows nothing about the issue, and it becomes sort of a problem. It becomes a problem for these people here because they didn't alert their senior management. Becomes an issue for this person because he doesn't know whether he needs to trust his team, and he's getting one-sided information, or she's getting one-sided information coming through this. So one of the best practices that we have implemented in virtually all of our alliances is when you set up expectations at the beginning of an alliance, you firmly address that at the beginning and say, we will have no unilateral escalation of issues. If you have an issue, you bring it up wherever it occurs, whether it's here or here or here, and before it gets escalated, if it gets escalated, we're going to jointly put together a summary of what the problem is and what the potential solutions are and why they don't work for one party or the other. And I can tell you 9 times out of 10 the problem gets resolved as you do that, because it's mostly around miscommunication, misunderstanding of objectives, and there's also a sense of you really don't want to bother the CEO with an escalation of a dispute if you can resolve it yourself. So it's one of those things that actually can build trust and builds a better functioning relationship when you can put that sort of thing in place right from the beginning. So there's one of those nuggets of what makes good alliances.
Question.
Yes.
Do you have examples where that escalation has happened and then you try to do it the other way? Or any suggestion? I've seen that escalation, and then it has become very difficult to try to do it the right way.
You mean on the next issue or with the same
The next
issue?
issue.
Well, you know, yes, I have seen it move from one to the other, because in the past it has been more routinely a unilateral escalation, and people get really bent out of shape in all of this. One of the most effective ways to change that is to do what we call the after-action review. So after you've worked through the problem, you get the team together and you say, now, let's just talk about what happened and what worked and what didn't work. One of my biggest concerns, and you know, I've been in the role myself, is that if you don't get all the facts, you end up finding that people at this level sometimes just don't have the time or the energy to figure out all of the context in the background. They just don't. But they'll make a decision, and it may not be implementable here. And it becomes a big headache. You know, it says, well, our CEO said we had to do this. And so that kind of review helps people understand that it's really counterproductive behavior to do that.
What about the one that was escalated, the current one? Let's say we have the current one. Do you keep then having the leaders work it out, or because some leaders are very eager to get in?
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yes. One of the things that that I did at Endo is with every new relationship is I met with the CEO from the new partner, and talked through what expectations they might have, but also we might have. And a key point of that conversation was, do you agree with this idea of joint problem resolution? And in the abstract, they do. And you say, then what we need from you is not to accept these issues. And you can see some of them squirm because they make decisions, that's what they do. But they do appreciate that it's going to be a better decision if they can push it down in their organization. Lots of good, just to finish off that comment, lots of good arguments for doing it. First, most of them recognize they don't always have the fact base that will come to a good implementable solution. The other thing is development of their staff. You know, how will they know what the strengths and weaknesses of their staff are if they don't get the responsibility to work this stuff out on their own? And most CEOs do perceive that they need to increase the strength of their management team. I mean, just for, develop people and all the rest. Colin, you had a question.
Just to build on your answer, I've been involved in these sort of situations where at one side it gets escalated. That's when you start seeing trust breaking down pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And the way that I have been involved in resolving this is actually to get the project team together face to face afterwards. Lock them in the room and say, guys, this is the problem, let's deal with it in an appropriate way, because you've got to rebuild the trust, because it has broken down by that point. Because somebody's being beaten up by their CEO, executive management, and they didn't even know they had a problem.
Yes.
So the other guys have just stabbed me in the back. It's been sort of way it's been thought through. The other piece is, in the project team charter, I've been involved in defining and getting agreement on the escalation process. And if somebody goes beyond it, you just go like the piece of paper, guys,
That's right.
this is what we've agreed, let's come back to it.
Yes.
And that's been a big benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, I've seen the steering committee break down because it gets too much involved at times in the detail of the day-to-day, as opposed to being a true steering committee.
Mm-hmm.
And again, defining the roles and responsibilities of that committee in the charter means in the meeting, we're getting into the nuance of whether or not it should be red or pink. Hold on, guys, it's whether or not we're going to deliver on time.
Right.
And so if you can build, without having a 50-page charter, my experience is if you can get enough detail in that charter, you help prevent or mitigate issues tomorrow.
My experience in negotiating agreements is that the responsibilities of the steering committee actually get spelled out in the contract. It doesn't stop members of that committee deciding to do more, but it does sort of bring it back to this is your core set of responsibilities. Even with the executive steering committee, they have their own team charter. It's a much shorter conversation because their responsibilities are spelled out in the contract, and then it just becomes how are we going to work together and reinforce the dispute resolution process. There was another question. Yes.
Maybe I don't know if this question is out of scope, but how do you teach culturally the project team to communicate about problems that occur in their own pillar? So perhaps say your alliance project leader is busy or distracted, some other functional leader in the company isn't performing, legal isn't reviewing, or finance isn't paying, or ops isn't delivering, or whatever, and so they're all getting frustrated. How do you teach culturally how to unlock your own dysfunction? You're not going to call the other side, but how do you escalate up, or how do you deal with that? How do you teach that culturally so that those project people don't get discouraged? And
Okay, I want to make sure I understand. So you're thinking about a problem that's really on your side of the alliance, and so you're thinking about the skill set that
alliance
you
isn't
have.
performing because of your own side.
Oh, that happens, absolutely. And so the cultural thing that you're looking for is what? How do you deal with it on your side of the fence?
Right. Well.
Or do you disclose to your partner?
Escalation can indicate dysfunction internally and lead to conflict, right? So I think maybe Colin was starting to get at something there in terms of predefining how things get worked out when it's established, right?
Yeah, I think that there's two elements to it in my mind. One is the whether you're in a partnership or not, these cross-functional issues come up all the time. Because people get busy doing their stuff and not doing the things that enable you to move forward on your objectives. So that clearly follows those same guidelines of, how do you escalate in your own hierarchy when you need to get the cooperation that you need. The other piece of it, though, is at what point do you alert your partner that this is an issue or is going to be an issue and work that through? And for me, I think that's part of the informal communication that happens at the Alliance Project leader level, and try and work it through. Because the other Alliance Project leader may say, look, this is absolutely critical. This decision has been delayed for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and we're getting into real trouble, and what can we do together to resolve this? Should we decide to escalate it together? Maybe. I mean, that typically is where we go. Yes?
There's also a back channel way to get around some of those things. A company may know we're just dysfunctional. We're big, we don't move as fast, we know you're faster and more nimble. So do me a favor, do it in your side on that part of the project, and just charge us for it, because we know internally that'll become critical path, will be a problem. So you gotta have a good relationship where they're meeting their own inherent problems as functioning problems as a company, and then using what you have together to try and get it done. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be judged just like you are in delivery. So
you think a little bit sometimes of diplomatic channels too, as a back channel, whether the responsibility gets transferred or the two heads of finance happen to know each other. So you don't have a formal escalation, but you can say, look, Jack, could you please call Sheila and ask her if she could please, move this along? And then you don't get into formal dispute resolution and things get resolved and everybody's going, we solved it. It's great. So, how are we doing for time? Excellent. Okay, good. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to give you a sense of how some alliances can be really quite different. If you think about the left side as your company and the bottom as your partner company, and the dimensions are strategic importance from low, something's really not that important to your partner, to high, it's critical for them to achieve their goals. And the same over here. The problems in alliances tend to come where you've got a mismatch, where in your company it's a high strategic priority, and to your partner, it's, hang on, how did I do this? Sorry, it's low. Yes, sorry, it's high to your partner, and it's low for you. And what you may find is that your partner is bugging you to get things done. And this often happens as a mismatch between small companies and large companies. Small companies, the partnership may mean everything to them. The large company, oh, it's part of our portfolio, we'll get to it when we get to it. And you may find that one is a real problem. The other side of it is you may find that the party that has the most resources in all of this can be the vulnerable enthusiast. They're saying, wow, this is so important and I'm going to pour all these resources into it. And their partner is going, yeah, not so important. So you end up having to do a lot more in the alliance to achieve your results, and that's not good. The other dimension is where there is a match, and perhaps it's a low strategic priority to both of you, then they're typically fairly simple alliances. They don't require a big governance structure to deal with. They don't require much mind share from senior management. It just is what it is. It's low for both of you, and it'll work out. If it turns out to be of high strategic importance to both companies, then you'll see a lot more focus, and the governance structure will typically be a lot more engaged because it is so important to both parties. And I put this out there as just the kind of thing that you think through as you're trying to figure out what kind of partnership is this likely to be, and how am I going to pay attention to the checks and the balances that are in the contract or in the governance structure. Things that you can do in the contract to manage the kind of thing where it's of low strategic importance to one of the partners and higher to the other are to set performance obligations in the contract, that you must achieve such and such by such and such a date, or there are penalties associated with it. And that can be a helpful thing to get action. So a lot of this can drive your thinking about what kind of structure is needed. So with that said, there were 3 major things I wanted to cover today at a high level. How do you make decisions around whether you build or partner? What are some of the considerations that define a competent partnering organization? And then lastly, when you think about putting together and then maintaining an effective alliance, what sorts of things do you think about and tools you use? So I turn it over to you now. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
So far, you really haven't addressed the asset management or money management that relates to the partnership.
Okay.
Do you have comments about equity involvement in such an alliance? And where does money flow to manage? Where's the budget come from between the two partners? And there's another part of that. If a partner doesn't have money but has value in terms of its technology,
Yes.
how do you value that contribution to the partnership?
Okay, those are great questions. First, a lot of this is dealt with in the agreement that you set up at the beginning. So when you think about where the resources are going to come from to accomplish the project, those are usually spelled out. Let's talk about project-oriented alliances first. Operational alliances are just a little different breed. So in project alliances, where one company typically has the intellectual property, perhaps some development capabilities, and wants to partner with a company that has more resources, perhaps money, more staff, commercial capability downstream, the agreement will specify who's going to do what, in what time frame, and who will pay for what, and where the rewards will come from downstream. So I can speak most knowledgeably to healthcare deals where typically there is, the structure may include some kind of upfront payment which helps the partner that has developed the technology get some return on the investment and risk that they've taken up to date. Then there are development milestones along the way that compensate for the proving out of the technology. And then in the commercialization side, there tend to be royalties that flow as the product earns more income. And I've seen deals where the smaller partner contributes really nothing except intellectual property and expertise, and the larger partner throws in the money because they really want this particular product. And where it changes is the balance of the returns. You know, if a smaller company with the IP is willing to continue to make investments in the development of the product, they get a bigger piece of the return at the end as a rule. That's how the argument goes. So that plays out that way. Equity can be involved or not. It really depends on the needs of the partners. I've done deals both ways. So every deal that I've ever looked at, and I've not just the ones I've done, but looked at, has had its own set of drivers as to what the parties needed at that particular time. Not always obvious to an outsider, but those inside the company said in both companies said this is what makes the deal work. So, I mean, does that get to some of your questions? I didn't mean to leave it out completely, but it typically is well worked out in the contract that's set up in place at the beginning. And then if it doesn't work, then the contract is amended somewhere along the way.
So some of the arguments for a big guy who's bringing in a new technology that they really want, they may argue, well, gee, without us on our marketing and our wealth to build this to a world level or national level product line, the little guy will say, oh, gee, I'm feeling, small in this equation, and I'll accept less.
Yeah.
But it depends on how do you formulate that. So at the beginning stages, that may be true, but later on, that could be just a huge product line for the mother company, or the alliance.
I really, if I'm representing a smaller company, I really don't feel good at the negotiating table unless I've got a really good alternative to doing the deal with the bigger partner. Because that's an argument that I've heard Pfizer often uses. Like, there's no other partner that can do for us what we can do for you, so you should just accept our terms and come along for the ride. And for some companies, that's been a really good thing. But you really always have to have alternatives. One of the stories I'm really familiar with is the Amgen Johnson & Johnson deal around erythropoietin, which turned into a multi-billion-dollar product. And at the time of the negotiations, Amgen was within 60 days of running out of cash, and the opportunity at that point was viewed as perhaps worth as much globally as about $160 million. I mean, in good faith. I mean, nobody really knew what this drug was going to do. And so the deal was done, and Amgen had no one else at the table and felt like they had been taken tremendous advantage of because they had no alternative. And there's arguments on both sides, but Amgen didn't have anybody else they brought to the table. So you have to assign some responsibility there as well. Their alternative was to go out of business. not a good alternative. Yes, I'm sorry, yes, you were next.
Yep, thank you. I was wondering if you could provide some insight into forming alliances in different sector areas, like whether it be a not-for-profit organization, an NGO, whether it's in the private sector or like private sector and NGO or private sector and not-for-profit. I mean, there's so many different sectors. How do you actually form an alliance with a different sector? And I mean, different sectors have different cash flow, stringencies, or how they actually do purchase orders and budgeting and all sorts of things. I mean, money moves in different ways in different sectors. So how do you actually form an effective alliance between different sectors?
That's a really good question, and I was hoping that Motoyo Kamiya was here today. She's with a startup company here at MaRS called Melanage, and she's focused on how public-private partnerships can work and how they should be structured and function. But some of the things that are clearly a challenge in those kinds of relationships is you've got a for-profit entity trying to work with a not-for-profit entity, and it's hard to imagine cultures that are more dissimilar and where the motives of each are really sort of suspect about how things get done. And the nexus of those relationships often is around corporate social responsibility, where major corporations are looking for opportunities to work in a social context, to do good and be seen to do good, and but not to the point that their main business purpose is compromised. It requires just more thinking about getting alignment on the goals. As I talk to Motoya, that appears to be the critical thing, and that the key members of the parties get to understand what are we trying to achieve together and why is it good for both of us. And those are the things that drive those. Between NGOs and two not-for-profit organizations, I can't speak to it. Is there anybody else here in the group that can? Ian.
John, we're involved as a private company working with an NGO, and the thing that comes to my mind is if you enter into that type of arrangement and spend your time on it, make sure that you can be satisfied of a consistency of cash flow to come through to the agreement. Because the NGO is typically, or the charitable organization, is dependent on raising money within their organization from donors. Economic factors, other factors within will take over. So you end up with one organization that would like very much to see this event happen, but don't dedicate the resources to support your drive and your team that's in place to take it to the next level. So it's a consistency aspect, but it's also their knowledge of business operations, because they think differently than you do as well, from a management structure as well as for the purpose of getting a project done. So those are a couple of things, if you enter into that relationship, to be mindful of. Some of them may work, but it's going to really depend on what the program director is in that foundation that's been assigned to work with you, and what resources they have and access to those resources to support your program. So we actually had to back away from that relationship quite an extent, and have entered into a private-private relationship where we have much more common thinking and direct access to consistency in funding. Does that help?
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
How you manage IP, which wasn't foreseen at the beginning of the alliance, but between partners?
And you can appreciate that when you've got two attorneys working out the deal issues, they just love that issue. So what happens when the two parties are working together? They may both bring IP to the collaboration, but then they develop new IP in the relationship. And that is, at least in the healthcare agreements, that is always clearly spelled out in the agreement about who owns what. Some of the things that I've learned during my time of working these things out is there are a number of frameworks to split the ownership. The thing that really doesn't make sense is joint ownership of IP, because if either party can license it out, it actually is worth nothing, because both parties are competitors for licensing out the technology, and it turns out to be not such a good thing. So ownership is one thing. Rights to use the IP under certain conditions are usually the way these things get worked out. So let's say I bring a molecule to you as a bigger partner you're going to develop, and there's joint IP that's developed around this, we might split it, that I am free to use all of the IP that's generated royalty-free for the development of that molecule, or maybe for the development of my portfolio, but I can't sublicense it. Whereas you, if you had the rights of ownership to it, you could sublicense it to others.
Do you spell out in the contract at the beginning all this?
Yes. Yeah. It's usually only 4 or 5 pages out of that. Much of it's boilerplate. Other questions? Yes.
So I'm the lawyer in the room. It's really hard with platform technologies because you could be working in one field, but you know it's useful somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
I have this problem right now. What we do over here is going to improve over here. What we do over here is going to improve over here, but no one ever sees it as a two-way street.
Yeah.
They just see as, I paid for it once, why should I pay for it again? Why should you get other commercialization rights? I'd say it's actually one of the most important things you're going to get into, because some companies will just want a product, they just, you know, it's a failure to supply problem for them. They just want the solution, but some will say, hey, you know what, we put money in, and therefore they'll try and take equity, or they'll try and take ownership of the IP. They'll try and find ways around other than just solving the problem, and then you know you're in for a bigger battle.
And I think that's a really good point. The earlier the stage of technology, the more thorny it gets.
Advancements, improvements, new IP, who patents it, who protects it.
Yeah.
Maybe you want the big partner to be the guy in the litigation court because you don't want to be that guy. So it's good to have a big gorilla partner with you, but you don't want them against you on the other side.
Yes, Jackie.
Yes. So John, you just mentioned that when there's an imbalance between the two partners, one is a small company, the other is a big company, this is not a good sign.
No. But that's a usual situation. The question is, how committed are they? Is it important to both of them?
So, as a business startup, how can I make sure that, of course, I want to stand on the giant. I want to stand on the giant to get more credibility, to get
Yes.
access to certain things.
Yeah.
So for me, this is everything for me. Whereas you mentioned that for the big guy, this is just one of their portfolio. So
Mhm.
how can I make sure that this is going to be a profitable relationship between the two of us? It's not
Well,
going to be a one-sided relationship.
Well, okay. Well, there's at least a couple of things there. I'm not sure that you can assure that it'll be profitable, but productive. Okay, so let me take it that way. When you're working with a large organization, the key thing is you need to find one or more champions in that organization who have the organizational role and influence that they can make this important. And so you wouldn't want to enter a relationship with a large company where your most supportive person was perhaps at the director level, and nobody else above that individual really cared too much about the product. That would be a challenge. But if you've engaged the head of research who says, I like this idea, this is important to me, or someone else in that organizational hierarchy, those are relationships that are really important, and you have to keep working on them. Because that's how you don't get lost in a big organization. You have key influential people who care about what it is that you're doing. One of the things that is always a concern is what happens if the company changes direction. Your sponsor may change their interests, or the sponsor gets transferred. So I'm a proponent of you never rely on just one relationship. Every opportunity you have, if you're the smaller company, you spend time with their senior management, you try to get them excited about what you're doing. That's your job.
So, but how do I integrate that with your governance model? So in your governance model, 4 levels, but as a startup, we're just one person or maybe 2, 3, 4 persons.
Yes.
So it's just one person who represents all 4 levels. So how do I make it happen?
Yes.
I work for major
that's a challenge.
corporations that work for Fortune 500 type of companies, which I used to be. But
Yeah.
now as a business startup, I'm everything. So
Yes.
I'm at all 4 levels. So how do I effectively implement that without being seen as going up, bypassing everybody?
Yeah, you only do what you can do. I mean, in the end, we've all got a certain amount of bandwidth, and we end up making our choices about what are the things that are the biggest risks for us and how are we going to manage those. And they change from week to week and all the rest. But opportunities also come along. I mean, you might get invited to a partner day, for example, where several partners of the big company are invited to come in and spend some time with management. And this sort of happens in bigger companies fairly often. Those are great opportunities to, leverage your time. So take a day out of your calendar and you can walk around the room and see who's excited about your idea, as opposed to trying to spend weeks tracking people down by telephone and they don't know you and they won't meet with you. And yes, but you do what you can do. Yes.
So you were mostly talking about, let's say, IP brought in and launching a product, like together and stuff. And then the other area I see a lot of collaboration happening is marketing, right? Joint marketing ventures.
Yes.
What are other areas that are very common for forming an alliance and partnership? And also if there are any new patterns or models of alliance that are like creative and, relatively new and stuff,
That's a really good question. And, you find when you go to meetings when there are people who work in the IT and communications space versus those who work in the healthcare space, the kinds of alliances that are involved on the two sides are really different. I mean, in the IT space, you've got network alliances, which the healthcare field is only starting to explore right now. Not just alliance-centric kind of businesses, but you actually have a network of alliances covering a lot of different opportunities to bring products in, to develop them, and work them through. The IT group, apparently, or IT sector, has been doing this more routinely. And then I understand, and I'm not an expert in this, they have more issues on the commercialization side of it, having networked to develop a product. Sometimes they'll deliver it together, sometimes they'll compete with each other for how they deliver it. And I have to admit, I don't quite understand how they all stay friends through that process, but they seem to continue to be able to work together. When you talk about what's new in the healthcare field, one of the trends that I see is you've been, perhaps if you follow the field in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of major pharmaceutical companies are downsizing their internal research organizations and relying more on staying in touch with smaller companies developing technology, which is good for many of us here. But it's a very practical decision from a large pharma company's perspective. That's one of the riskiest areas of development. So if public and private money can be used to fund companies, 90% of whom don't make it, it wasn't their money. Of course, they have to pay more when they find an opportunity they want. That's the other thing you see, is that early stage opportunities are getting more money now. It's fair. Yes, Hans.
I'm just curious, in your mind, which company or which organization in life sciences do you think sort of typifies? It's really an organization that excels at alliance management?
The organization that I talked about, the Association of Strategic Alliance Professionals, has had an annual Alliance Excellence Award program for, I guess, the last 8 or 9 years. And you'll see a number of companies called out for their particular practices in setting up and managing alliances effectively. So there are a few companies in the IT field who leap to mind as having done things. And in the pharmaceutical field, there's been a mix of large and small companies. Endo got recognized, for example. There were very few companies of its size that were so semi-virtual. Most in the older world, most companies would give that up once they got to 200 million in sales. Okay, we can do it all ourselves, and Endo never did. They said it's a virtue to be an alliance-centric model. One last question, sir.
And this is more of a comment. Open innovation, if anybody is in that, is a very good alternative. So if you have intellectual property and you're looking for a partner, you could also actually, and I've seen a lot of examples of it, sell off either the whole thing or a piece of it. And also, if you're a small company, you might get hold of a lot of distressed assets, as they're called, because so many innovators can't find the money. But one alternative, it's smaller money involved then, but it's an alternative. It's a whole field in itself.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure, and hope to see you for, when is the next one, John?
I don't know. You check the MaRS website. Sorry.
It's on the 23rd, and actually the speaker.
Yes, Colin Mincham will be your speaker at the next session. Thanks, everybody.